All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on the program, we continue our educational journey in Africa. We finished the Horn of Africa, and we'll be journeying to all of the middle of Africa and Central Africa. So, in another of our All Things Africa edition, we'll be learning about Kenya today. And again, who better to teach us about this country and the continent than our returning champion, Abayomi Azikiwe, the founder and contributor to Pan-African Newswire. He's an independent journalist and historian coming to us from Detroit, and he's a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports. So let's get into it. First of all, Abayomi, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and all the great work you're doing. I've noticed you've been doing a lot of interviews recently, and that's good.
Well, thank you very much, and it's always an honor to have you on. And oh, yes, and let's also remind folks, please help us grow the channel. And the only way to do that is if you like our videos, share widely both past and recent content that One Plus One produces. And yes, and please support independent media. One Plus One is entirely in indie, so please donate us generously if you can, and donate however much, and donate however much you can. And now on to the topic at hand, and thank you for that, Abayomi. And so, Abayomi, tell us about Kenya. Tell us some basic facts about Kenya, and then talk to us about British colonialism in Africa. Please do give us an idea of how awful Anglo-colonialism was in Kenya, and then my only follow-up question with that is, what are some of the ongoing terrible legacies from that colonial project, which still actually impacts Kenya today? I'm curious for response.
Yes, and thank you once again. Yes, British colonialism is still having an impact on the East African region under which they control. They had a broad colonial system of both classical colonialism, settler colonialism, and of course the protectorate system. And this started approximately around the latter years of the 19th century. As well as parts of Tanzania. Now that changed, of course, after World War One, when the Germans lost their colonies in Africa, which actually created the conditions for the rise of fascism, and of course World War II. But Britain, up until 1920, had ran Uganda, Kenya, and parts of Zanzibar as well as protectorate colonies. And of course, in 1920, became a formal colony, colony of Britain, and it remained as such. They mainly displaced the African population. People were forced to work in the agricultural plantations of Kenya, growing coffee, tea, and other agricultural products. People were treated virtually as slaves in Kenya. Prior to 1963, when the country gained its independence. The country, of course, went through a tumultuous period between 1952 and 1960 during the so-called Mau Mau Rebellion.
And actually, before you get to the Mau Mau Rebellion, which was my which is my second question, because you were talking about how Kenya was first. So it was first a protectorate, you say?
It was a colony, and then after that became a protectorate.
And what is a protectorate for people who may not know that, as well as the as well as the settler colonialism, which was implemented in Kenya, as you say, it was a combination. It was sort of a cocktail of all of those awful things of colonialism. But yeah,
it's pretty much the same thing as colonialism. It's just a term that's utilized to make it appear as if the indigenous people have some autonomy, which in actuality, it's all based upon the whims and caprices of the imperialist powers. So in essence, a protectorate is pretty much a colony, although in a formal sense, it's a little bit different because they do consult with some of the leadership of the indigenous groups. If that consultation leads to agreement in regard to British or European colonial policy. If they don't agree with what the British are saying, then of course you could be imprisoned. They engaged in public capital punishment or flogging. For example, people were beaten in public for not going along with what the British authorities wanted them to do.
Wow.
And these are some of the problems that the masses faced in Kenya during the 19th and, of course, the period in the 20th century all the way up until 1960. So, yes, it was a horrible system, gross labor exploitation, largely in the agricultural sector. There's not a lot of mineral wealth in the country, but at the same time, the agricultural wealth in Kenya brought tremendous profits to the British imperialists, particularly in the tea industry and the coffee industry. Later, of course, there was the advent of tourism in Kenya, which is still a major factor in the national economy. But yes, now prior to British colonialism, of course, we had Kenya has a tremendous history. In fact, just about 40 years ago, they discovered human fossils from the pre-Homo sapiens sapien category, the Homo erectus category, which dated back some 1.6 million years. So this area of Africa has a lot of evidence that suggests that it was the origin of human civilization in East Africa. And whether it's Kenya, Ethiopia, these areas, of course, there have been findings from archaeologists and paleontologists and also anthropologists, which strongly provides evidence that this is the origin of human beings as we know them today, as well as human civilization and human society.
Fascinating.
Just to bring that up. So this is a very old region of the continent. And then after that, of course, they were involved in trade with people from Persia as well as Oman, which is considered an Arab country. That went on for centuries. Mombasa was a major port city that had a lot of economic activity long before Europe, in fact, became the center, Western Europe and North America became the center of the world economic system. So that gives you some background in regard to Kenya. It's a very historic region of Africa and the world indeed.
Well, I wasn't planning on asking this as a follow-up question, but since you mentioned that actually that there was a very advanced kind of civilization in what is present day Kenya. So, because a lot of times, even I think the best anti-colonialist historians and anti-imperialist historians, they sort of depict Africa as all. I wouldn't use the word backwards, but they sort of depict all of Africa as just being very much an indigenous, nomadic sort of population that did not have, what we would consider an advanced economy and so forth like that, or even advanced civilizations apart from very small tribal ones, which would engage in a lot of nomadic behavior because of the very tough environment that exists in Africa still to this day. But from what you were saying was that actually in places like Kenya, they actually did have advanced civilizations that actually was engaging in in economic trade with what's now known as West Asia or the Middle East and so forth. So anyways, I find that quite fascinating because the British colonialists, they often talk about, well, these were not advanced societies, ergo that's why we subjugated them to brutal colonialism. I'm curious your response on that.
Well, all these narratives were created to justify enslavement as well as colonialism, to say that the people were backwards, that the land was barren, and if they had not shown up, that is the imperialists and the colonialists, then there wouldn't have been any development in these areas. So they try to credit all human development to the advent of slavery and colonialism, which is totally false. Even some British historians, for example, Basil Davison, who wrote extensively as a journalist as well as a historian, talked about the civilizations, the lost cities of Africa, and other civilizations. He even did I believe it was an 8 or 9 part series back in the early 1980s entitled Africa. It's still available on YouTube, where he goes step by step. This is Basil Davison in talking about the origins of human civilization in Africa and how it developed all the way up until the 1980s. So that would be a very fascinating series for people to watch. But yes, there were many civilizations and cultures throughout the continent. In East Africa, you had city-states, particularly in the area along the East African area, the Indian Ocean basin. I mentioned Mombasa, and there were many others in Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and so forth. So you had a lot of trade with the people of Oman, including slavery as well. I mean, there are a lot of Africans who wound up in Oman due to the slave trade, the East African slave trade from Zanzibar, and it went all the way over to West Asia. Now, that type of enslavement that took place there was distinguished from the Atlantic slave trade in the sense that many of the people who were brought ostensibly as slaves from Zanzibar, for example, to Oman, many of those people wound up in the upper echelons of society among the Omani people.
Interesting.
And they're still there now. People can look it up. You can look at the complexions of the people. You can look at the skin colors, their culture, and so forth. And of course, that distinguishes it from the Atlantic slave trade into the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the United States, where even today, we're talking about over 400 years later from the beginning of British enslavement in North America, that African people of African descent, are still suffering from national oppression, racism. We make up the disproportionate amount of people in the prison system who are impoverished and so forth. So I just wanted to bring that up because this area of East Africa has a very long history, very, very long history. And when we talk about British colonialism there, it was devastating to the people, to the societies in terms of displacement, economic exploitation, sickness, as well as death. Many, many Africans died as a result of colonialism in East Africa. And there was always resistance, too. That's important to point out. Even when the British built the railroads, people resisted against the encroachment on their lands.
And of course, well, what you just mentioned, those are some of the terrible legacies of colonialism that still impacts today. And just before we get to the Mau Mau, I also wanted to give people just an idea of how terrible British colonialism was, particularly with Kenya. Now, there was also a very distinct form of racial capitalism that the British imposed in Kenya, in which the mass indigenous Black Kenyan population were sort of the Dalits, were sort of the untouchables, and then you had South Asian Africans who, even though they were met with terrible racism, would get a lot of jobs. Sometimes, small businesses jobs like convenience stores, and so what we now see as modern day convenience stores, and even some of those urban markets, which if people visit Africa, you'll still wherever you go in Africa, you'll still find a lot of like urban markets, often in galleries. They look sort of like very big, kind of like like antique sort of places where they'll sell you everything from food to decorations to stuff to all kinds of stuff, carpets and whatnot. And apparently, during colonialism, the South Asians had a lot of those jobs, which sort of put them in a middle class, precarious middle class, but still a very good middle class position. And then of course, the owners of the of the agricultural industry were mostly these very tiny white farmers who treated their colonial subjects, the mass black indigenous populations, like dirt and so forth. So I feel it's very important to add that, and that's a perfect segue then to talk about this. So talk to us about the Mau Mau rebellion to get the British out. And I understand that the Mau Mau were often ruthless in their quest for independence. So while some did do unspeakable atrocities which were inflicted on innocent, so to speak, unarmed British settlers, uh, but the British colonialists later weaponized some of these half truths, and made that into full-on fake news to justify their own unspeakable acts of atrocities in Kenya, engaging in massive collective punishment, building up concentration camps, and engaging in systemic torture of suspected Mau Mau sympathizers and actual Mau Mau fighters. So please tell us all about this, and I'm curious your response to all I've just mentioned.
In regard to the Indian population or South Asian population, they were brought in as a mechanism of undermining the status as well as the labor power of the African people. And they were brought in, many of them, to work on the railroads during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's important to point this out, that they were brought in as workers. It's the same situation in South Africa, as well as parts of the Caribbean. Even in Guyana, for example, the Indian population there was brought in largely as laborers. When they attempted, the Indian population, to advance their political and social status in Kenya, they were not allowed to do so. And in most cases, as in South Africa or Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania, their well-being and advancement was closely linked to the African liberation struggles, because the British would not recognize them, even though they used them as a buffer between the African masses and the British colonialists, but they would not grant them any higher status or status that would equate them on an equal basis with the European colonial powers. They were a small segment of the population, but they played a key role in terms of the medium sector of the commercial aspect of society. As you mentioned, people who ran convenience stores, who were heavily involved in certain aspects of the economy. That was the role that they played. And of course, this created hostility between the African population and the Indian population as well. When you look at the situation, for example, in South Africa, what was important was that the Indian population, the progressive forces, united with the African and mixed race populations. And this was key in bringing down the apartheid system. This began in the 40s. It continued in the 1950s when you had the Defiance campaign in South Africa. So in Kenya, for example, the Indian population was relatively small. So in terms of the actual liberation movements, the Africans played an enormous role in bringing about the decline of direct British colonial rule in Kenya, which took place in 1963 when the country gained independence. But prior to that, of course, you had the so-called Mau Mau Rebellion. Now, the Mau Mau, its real name was the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army. That was the real name of it, and it was mainly composed of people from the Kikuyu ethnic group, although there were others involved as well. For example, the Luos, which was another major ethnic group in Kenya. And in 1952, they began to attack British installations, taking people property, destroying their property. They were demanding the return of the land to the indigenous African people. And the British responded to this with a very ruthless campaign, and they declared a state of emergency between 1952 and 1960, where tens of thousands of Africans were slaughtered, interned in prison camps, where people died of starvation, they died of torture, and other horrendous ailments, including diseases. And this went on for approximately a decade. And after that, the British were forced to actually bring about some type of transitional process, which led to independence in December of 1963. But unfortunately, after independence in 1963, and the country became a republic in 1964, it was closely allied, maintained close alliances with the United States and other Western imperialist countries. And that has been a bone of contention in Kenya for the last 6 decades. The country is still heavily dependent upon tourism. It's still heavily allied with the United States, has close ties with the Israeli Zionist regime. And that's why, there's still unrest that's going on in Kenya up until this day.
Fascinating. So, and also important to note that Kenya, it is a member of the Commonwealth, but the British monarch isn't the head of state in Kenya. Now,
after it became a republic,
yeah,
that was only after it became a republic. And when they got independence in '63, Queen Elizabeth II was considered, quote, head of state, unquote. And then, of course, in 1964, the country became a republic under Jomo Kenyatta. The Kenyan African National Union Party was the ruling party for many, many years in Kenya. But as I said, they still maintain a close alliance with Western imperialism.
Exactly. And actually, so talk to us about Kenya's first historical figure after independence. You just mentioned his name, a man by the name Jomo Kenyatta. Now, so I was shocked to learn that he was imprisoned by the British. He was even tortured, but apparently he himself was not part of the Mau Mau, though he most likely harbored, you know, he most likely harbored sympathizing views in wanting, Kenyan independence, wanting to address, legitimate grievances. But at the same time, he's one of those complex African figures like Haile
Right.
Selassie, in that he was a Pan-Africanist. He did display African nationalism, particularly Kenyan nationalism. But that being said, this did not make him a flaming left-winger, and he foolishly bought into the whole non-aligned movement, thinking that if you have neutral, good relations with the West, and you sort of don't have close ties, but you're quote unquote friendly with the Soviet Union and their bloc, you think that the West isn't going to continue exploiting you and engage in neo-colonialism. So with all that being said, I'm curious how do you assess his legacy?
Yeah, like you said, it's very complex. He was part of the Pan-African movement, particularly in England. He was a participant in the Fifth Pan-African Congress that was held in Manchester in October of 1945. And of course, that was a very important gathering. It drafted a program of action, which was, people can read it today to see that it was an advancement over the programs that were advanced in the previous Pan-African Congresses and the Pan-African Conference of 1900 in England and the Chicago Congress of 1893 in Chicago. But in 45, they agreed upon creating mass organizations, mass political parties to move towards independence now. Kwame Nkrumah was there as well from the Gold Coast. He had arrived there from spending 10 years in the United States, where he studied at Lincoln University and the University of Pennsylvania. And of course, they drafted a program with the assistance of Malcolm Nurse, popularly known as George Padmore, and others who were there in 1945. And of course, after that, they formed what was called the Pan-African Federation. They were doing a lot of support work under the guidance of George Padmore. And Nkrumah went back, of course, to Ghana in 1947 and was arrested, formed eventually the Convention People's Party. Now, Kenyatta, of course, was an outspoken critic of British colonialism. He wrote a book called Facing Mount Kenya. He was arrested and detained for many years, but he was someone the British felt they could work with, and he was released and, of course, became the first prime minister and the first president of Kenya. But there were problems with other independence leaders, particularly Oginga Odinga, who was from the Luo group. And he was considered more to the left of Kenyatta.
Interesting.
Yeah. And Tom Mboya was another trade unionist who, in a sense, was considered to the right of Kenyatta. Tom Mboya was involved in the first All-African People's Conference that was held in Ghana in December of 1958. He became a key figure in that process. But he fell out of favor with a lot of progressive forces in Africa, and even here in the United States. People accused him of being a collaborator with the U.S. imperialist system. So it's a very complex history when we look at Kenya, particularly during the anti-colonial period, because we had the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which was a revolutionary movement that took up arms against the British colonialists. And Britain did not want an outright military defeat. So therefore, they agreed on a transitional process. And that transitional process, of course, resulted in the creation of the Republic of Kenya, which has been in existence now for over 60 years. So today in Kenya, we have the presidency of William Ruto, who heads a party that came out of a series of splits. KANU was split, and of course, Daniel Arap Moi took over after the death of Jomo Kenyatta.
Perfect. Actually, well, that's actually perfect segue because that's exactly what I wanted to ask about. So Jomo died. In fact, it's also important to know Jomo died in office. He was succeeded by a member of his party, Daniel Arap Moi, of the African National Congress. And he himself, in the very early 60s, from 1963 from 1960 to 1963, was a member of the Kenyan African Democratic Union. How do you assess his legacy? And please do talk to us about the good and the bad, and the ugly, because again, very complex African figures, both Jomo Kenyatta and this gentleman as well. Uh-oh. What moments? Oh, sorry about that, folks. We're having a bit of internet problems.
Yes.
Can you hear me now, Abayomi?
Daniel Arap Moi.
Go ahead.
I was freezing up for a minute. But anyway, I was just wanted to mention that Daniel Arap Moi followed in many ways the policies of Jomo Kenyatta. He maintained a close link with the West, also with the state of Israel. And under his administration in 1982, there was an attempted coup led by some lower-ranking Air Force officers. And they attempted to overthrow the KANU government. And they seemed to be articulating an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist position. Now, this group within the Air Force was not successful, and the KANU government was reinstated, and it stayed in power for many, many years after that. And then there was a big split inside of the Kenyan African National Union, and there was several other political parties that came to the surface after that. And of course, Kenyatta's son, Uhuru Kenyatta, wound up winning the elections in 2000 and 2013. And of course, he served 2 terms in office, but the situation with him, of course, was also complicated because of the split between the son of Oginga Odinga. He ran for office as well, and there was a big conflict between the 2 different political parties. Many people died as a result of internecine fighting. But when Uhuru Kenyatta took over, some progressive forces supported him because they thought that Riley Odinga was to the right of him. He served 2 terms, and then there was a split inside of his party. And today we have William Ruto, who had taken over. And he, of course, still has serious internal problems inside of Kenya. Now, we can look at what happened last year in Kenya. Kenya has an enormous debt obligation. I think it's something like over 60% in regard to the debt ratio in relationship to the gross domestic product. So the country is heavily in debt. And last year they imposed a new tax system, which would tax even more heavily services as well as products. And as a result of that, unrest erupted in the country during the middle of 2024. People were killed, people were arrested, people were calling for Ruto's resignation. He refused to resign. There was a tremendous amount of repression inside of Kenya. People were disappeared there. So it's been a problem ever since last summer in terms of the internal political situation inside of Kenya. Now, the fact that the tax proposal, the tax bill in Kenya last year had to be withdrawn due to broad-scale civil unrest and rebellion, they had to cancel their program with the International Monetary Fund, the program to bring down their debt. It had to be canceled. Now they're working on a new program, IMF loan program, and it remains to be seen what impact this is going to have on the country as well. So many African countries today are starting to relive, in a sense, the turmoil of the 1970s and the 1980s and the early 1990s, when debt was massive and it had to be restructured. Otherwise, the Europeans would have never been able to collect their debt. But it's still a major problem on the continent, and Kenya is a case in point for the international debt crisis on the African continent.
Fascinating. And when I was doing my research into Kenya and the domestic body politics, I think outsiders, including Pan-Africanist leftists across Turtle Island, Britain, elsewhere, and others, we get this popular image that Kenya, despite being plagued by poverty and corruption and so forth, we get this image that Kenya is one of the more stable African countries, one of the more safest places to travel, and the way politics is, and that the way politics is done in Kenya is a model for the continent. However, when reading about the 6 political parties that have governed Kenya, which are the Kenyan African National Union, the Party of National Unity, the National Alliance, the Jubilee Party, and the United Democratic Alliance, one actually will be horrified that all of these parties are right-wing parties. The leaders of these parties, who have been heads of states, have all been right-wingers, and they are so right-wing that even their parties are actually members of the International Democratic Union, which is where all the center-right and even far-right parties meet to unite the right and talk about how they can help each other out and set the world for a right-wing agenda. The IDU was founded by Margaret Thatcher. Its current chairperson is Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister of Canada, who is a member of the Conservative Party, and its vice chairperson is Brian Loughnane, who is a member of the Liberal Party of Australia, which is the Aussie version of the Republican Party, the Tory Party of Canada and Britain, the Aussie version of the National Party of New Zealand, the Kiwi version. And it's a party that has actually been in coalition government with the equally grotesque right-wing party, the Nationals. So all those Kenyan parties are all members of the Democrat Union of Africa, which is where all the supposedly center-right to far-right African parties across the continent meet to help one each other out and set forth a right-wing agenda for the continent. So I was wondering if you can speak to this, and I'm curious your response to this.
Yes, Kenya is stable in the sense that there's never been a military coup in the country. I mentioned in 1982, there was an attempt, by some left-leaning Air Force officers to take over the government. It was based upon some theoretical writings that had been done in subsequent months and years. But yes, all the governments have been moderate to right wing. And even today, the president, Ruto, is listed ideologically as being a conservative. Now, he has one key indicator of this is that he has gone along with the IMF program of austerity for Kenya. This is what caused so many problems last year inside the country, so much turmoil, where people died, they were arrested, property was destroyed, there were resignations from the various positions within the Kenyan parliament. Also, another indication of this is that the Biden administration convinced and also rewarded the Kenyan government in regard to sending police to Haiti in a supposed stabilization mission there. And it doesn't appear as if they've been successful at all in normalizing the situation in Haiti. But the fact that the U.S. went to them and made this proposal involving hundreds of millions of dollars to send not the Kenyan military, but the Kenyan police to Haiti is a clear indication that they're in the Western imperialist camp. And what's unfortunate about this is that Ruto himself knows that the United States is up to no good in Haiti. He should know the history of U.S. imperialism in Haiti and should not have participated in such an operation, which has not been successful at all. So these are some of the problems that Kenya is facing today. They've also been involved in peacekeeping operations, supposed peacekeeping operations. They sent troops into Somalia during the early phase of the Amazon, the African Union mission to Somalia. Kenya made up a tremendous component of that. So did Uganda and Ethiopia. So yes, these are all indications of the rightward political trajectory of the Kenyan government. Nonetheless, they have probably 55, 56 million people in the country, and there have been left-wing personalities and organizations that have surfaced over the last several years. I can think of the novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who used to be James Ngugi, was a left-wing novelist, essayist. He was heavily involved in cultural production in Kenya, was arrested for researching and doing cultural presentations around the Mau Mau Rebellion of the 1950s.
Interesting.
He claims, Ngugi claimed that it was against the law. And in fact, he was sent to prison for using materials and for also making certain assertions about the outcome of the Mau Mau Rebellion during the early 1960s. Now, he's been in exile from Kenya for over 40 years. He did go back after the removal of Daniel Arap Moi, but largely he's been here in the United States. He's spent time in England as well, teaching at universities and writing. So he's one good example. Also, during the 1960s and early 70s, there was one Kenyan national who was here in the States who formed, was in the leadership for many years of what was known as the Pan-African Students Organization of the Americas, PASOA. Be interesting to do research on them. They did a lot of African solidarity work, anti-imperialist work in the United States and in Canada during the between 1960 up until the early 1970s. And his name was Maina Wa Kenyatta, was leading political figure, but he was always in the opposition and was never in favor. He didn't have any praise whatsoever from the Kenyan government. So these are some of the some of the figures. So it shows that there's a potential there for some type of left-wing movement in Kenya. They do have a Communist Party there. They have some other left groups, but they've not been able to get mass support on an electoral basis in Kenya.
Well, that's very fascinating. Now, so then talk to us then about the legacies of I hope I'm not butchering his name, Mwai Kibaki, who again he's been a member of who's actually been a member of all of these right wing parties, has governed in coalition with these right wing parties, and the only left leaning or social democratic party that was in government, albeit in a coalition with the right, was the National Rainbow Coalition. But he left that party, I suspect because he's really a right winger and it is more right leaning. So yeah, talk to us about his legacy, the good, if there is any, the bad and the ugly.
Yeah, well, he followed a similar pattern as the others who were proponents of strong alliances with the West. Of course, in back in that was in 2008, they had a huge outbreak of violence over a disputed election between Raila Odinga and his opponent Kibaki. That was resolved through a coalition government that lasted for about 4 or 5 years. After that, that's when Uhuru Kenyatta uh, won the elections in 2013, defeating Raila Odinga. And then, of course, they were brought before the International Criminal Court and charged with using ethnic intimidation during that whole conflict over who was actually going to be the head of state of Kenya during 2008. That ICC case against Ruto and Kenyatta collapsed. The ICC said because of lack of evidence, but we all know the history of the International Criminal Court. It has been heavily focused on African leaders and African rebel leaders who have committed atrocities, no doubt about it, but they have not done anything about what the U.S. has done internationally. For example, the false claims surrounding the Second Iraq War, that there were weapons of mass destruction that need to be destroyed. That was all a lie. And George Bush should have been brought before the International Criminal Court. And of course, he was never investigated or indicted. The state of Israel, for example, there was arrest warrants put out for Benjamin Netanyahu, along with the Hamas leaders as well, which you cannot do. You can't say that the people who take up arms to resist against settler colonialism are just as guilty as those who perpetuate settler colonialism.
Exactly.
But at any rate, they did issue a warrant for the Israeli leader. And of course, this has outraged the United States as well as the state of Israel. So they're now very angry with the ICC. And we'll have to see what actually happens in that regard. But yes, the state of Israel is heavily protected by U.S. imperialism and other Western imperialist countries. We've seen recently the expulsion of the South African ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, from the United States. It just happened a week ago. And they said he was anti-American. He hated Trump. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Republic of South Africa took the state of Israel to the International Court of Justice, ICJ, which is the highest United Nations judicial body. And they ruled over a year ago that their charges of genocide against the Palestinian people were plausible. So the U.S. said this case had no merit. And they have been angry with the Republic of South Africa ever since that time period. So now Trump expels the ambassador, and we'll see what happens if they allow another ambassador to be appointed, and whether or not the Republic of South Africa will maintain diplomatic relations with the United States. So all of this has a lot to do with the ongoing struggle against neo-colonialism in Africa.
Exactly, and you know, and also in recent news, even though I completely do not like you know, Rodrigo Duterte, who is definitely guilty of unspeakable crimes against humanity in his drug war and so forth. But
yeah, he's the latest. Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is this. Okay, so I do so he has committed, crimes against humanity, and his way of treating, drug addiction and the drug war is grotesque. But by that very logic, if you're going to put Duterte into prison for the rest of his life, or even prosecute him, then
Right.
then the then I mean, the U.S. should be in jail then for its drug war. Britain should be in jail for its drug war. In fact, every single Western advanced country should be in jail for their ruthless prosecution of people consuming drugs. Most of them non-violent users who innocently smoke pot, sniff cocaine, or anything like that. So all of them, by that logic, should be in jail. And the fact of the matter is, the U.S. props up every single major drug cartel. The U.S. and its allies, prop up, and so it's outrageous that Duterte is in prison, and then on top of that, Ferdinand Marcos, a U.S. puppet, has never been in the international court for his unspeakable crimes against humanity. Pol Pot himself of the Cambodian genocide was also never ever brought to justice because the West supported him. So it's outrageous. And oh, one moment.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, sorry about that, folks. Having some internet problems. So I think it's very important to mention that, especially with the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu
Yeah. Well,
has
yeah. This is
still not been arrested.
no, and they're still sending bombs there every day, weapons. They still have diplomatic recognition by the United States and other Western imperialist countries. So it's so much hypocrisy that's going on on the part of the United States in this regard. But I think that the International Criminal Court is in a huge crisis at this point because they really have no authority to implement anything against the United States or against the state. There's have the former president of Philippines extradited to the Netherlands to sit there and rot and to stand trial. And these other people are walking around as if nothing has ever happened. So I think it's a tragic situation. And Trump, for example, is a convicted felon. He's an adjudicated rapist. He attempted to overthrow the results of an election 4 years ago. Yet he's in the White House. He was allowed to run again, allowed to take office. He appointed Elon Musk, gave him the keys to the vault, so to speak. So it's outrageous what the West is doing, but they're suffering, and the people are suffering because of their actions. We see what's going on at the stock market. Even companies like Tesla, that's owned by Elon Musk, is losing billions of dollars just over the last few weeks. People are attacking his dealerships,
Yeah.
damaging the cars, setting fire to them, and so forth. So his company is losing a lot of money. On Bloomberg yesterday, they were saying that since it's a public company, it has a board of directors. They should select another CEO, and or either order him back to the office, like he ordered his employees back to the office, or be fired. So the shareholders should order Elon Musk back to the office to leave the White House, or else they're going to get another CEO for the company. But
one can only hope. Now,
he'll probably run into the ground like he's running Twitter into the ground. And
exactly.
Yeah.
So
Trump is running how many companies into the ground?
Exactly. So let's return to Kenya though. Okay. Now, Mwai Kibaki, despite his reputation of friendly relations with the West and this image of governing a stable Kenya, and he himself was quite a charming and personable individual, and politician. And there was an election in which he and his party won. As you mentioned, the opposition claimed it was fraudulent. Then, much to the surprise of the outside world and even Africans themselves, there was horrific violence between the supporters. Eventually, there was a power sharing agreement that was made, and then Kenya was governed by, you already mentioned his name, Uhuru Kenyatta, who was the son of Jomo. Now, before you tell us about his legacy, is there anything about his background and what happened in Kenya in the early 2000s when there was bloody violence between his supporters and Kibaki that you think it's important for audiences to know? Talk to us about then, and then talk to us about Kenyatta's legacy, Kenyatta's legacy.
Yeah, the ethnic diversity of the country has been weaponized politically. And we saw this in the 1960s with Oginga Odinga, who was more to the left of Jomo Kenyatta, and who was held under house arrest for many years. But a lot of people in the West did admire him. In fact, he came to the United States in 1963 and met with members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They wrote a song called Oginga Odinga. Yeah, right. You can. It's on YouTube. You can listen to the song. It's a great song by the SNCC Freedom Singers. But yeah, that development in 2008 was devastating. I mean, many people were killed. A lot of property was destroyed, and they eventually agreed to form a coalition government, which governed up until 2012, 2013, when Uhuru Kenyatta came in. And he served between 2013 up to 2017. And of course, he eventually won another term after Riley Odinga, who was the son of Oginga Odinga, claimed that he had won, that he had been cheated out of the elections of 2016. And of course, they withdrew, the opposition party withdrew from the runoff. There was one election which they contested. The court said, okay, let's run the election again, the Kenyan Supreme Court. They withdrew, Odinga supporters withdrew, and the government of Kenyatta won largely by default during his second term. And you only allowed 2 terms in Kenya. And then, of course, the vice president under Uhuru Kenyatta was William Ruto, and he won, and of course is still in office today. So these are some of the developments that have been going on. But Kenya, there's still a lot of poverty. There's still a lot of unrest inside the country. And of course, I mentioned earlier, the debt crisis is mounting. And who knows what IMF conditionalities are going to be imposed on the country over the next few months.
And
what the response is going to be from the youth and the workers in Kenya.
So how now? You've already talked about him a couple of times, but I'll still ask this question, which is, how do you assess the term of the current right-wing president of Kenya, William Ruto, which we've seen, and as you mentioned, we've seen popular uprisings against him, the vast destitute poor in Kenya, the working class who are very much poor. I would say I would even use the term working poor, because these are folks who do live in makeshift slums with the destitute poor and the very tiny precarious middle class. They all seem to have a deep disgust and very deep distrust of Ruto compared to other heads of states in the past. So tell us, tell us more your assessment of William Ruto. All right, so Abayomi, so you were going to talk to us. So how do you assess William Ruto's tenure in office?
I think 2 things has damaged his reputation. One, of course, was the tax bill from last year, which was rejected, particularly by the youth and the workers in Kenya. Also, his deployment of Kenya police to Haiti. Now, this went before the Kenyan Supreme Court last year, saying that it was unconstitutional. The Constitution did not provide any provisions for the police to be deployed to foreign states. Yet it was done anyway, despite the objection of the court system in Kenya. So these are at least 2 elements of discontent on the part of the masses in Kenya. So I think with the upcoming renegotiation of IMF conditionalities, it would just create more hostility on the part of the youth and the workers and the farmers in Kenya against the Ruto government.
And then thank you for that. And my second to last question on Kenya is this, which is, what is Kenya's real role in African affairs and international relations? You've already talked to us about how Kenya, much to Kenya, much to its detriment, has been closely aligned with the West, and unlike its neighbors, Congo, Uganda, or the Horn of African countries, or Southern African countries. Again, Kenya has enjoyed a great deal of stability and international popularity due to its reputation of it being one of the more stable countries and even neutral countries. You already actually talked about this, but there was a period in the late 2000s and even 2010s where Somali terrorists would attack Kenyan embassies. In the 90s, bin Laden and his ghoulish gang of Al Qaeda even blew up Kenyan embassies and others because they viewed them as being closely aligned with the U.S. At my school, at the school I used to go to, the International School of Brussels, we had several Kenyan families whose parents worked as ambassadors, diplomats, and so forth. And they would often express their surprise that Kenya would be targeted, because the line was, we didn't do anything to deserve these attacks. We're neutral and we're not formally aligned with the West in any way. So Abayomi, being our mythbuster, what is Kenya's real role with regards to Anglo-American, Canadian, and Pan-European imperialism in Somalia, both North and South Sudan, and other African nations that face the full evil wrath of Western imperialism?
Yeah, there have been several attacks in Kenya by people who purport to be members of Al-Shabaab. They attacked a hotel several years ago and killed a number of guests there and staff members there. And that was directly linked to the fact that Kenya was playing an instrumental role in the war inside of Somalia. So yeah, it's very important to recognize these factors. And also in terms of them going into Somalia, this was done largely at the aegis of the United States back during 2007 and later 2008. So they're very close to the US, and the same situation involving Haiti. They sent the police there, despite the fact that there was broad opposition to it among the masses, as well as among the judicial system and opposition politicians in Kenya as well. So yes, and in 1998, the US Embassy in Nairobi, as well as in Dar es Salaam in the United Republic of Tanzania, were bombed, ostensibly by Al Qaeda. And Bill Clinton, who was US president at the time, turned around and bombed not only Afghanistan, but also Khartoum, Sudan, and destroyed a pharmaceutical plant there and other structures that were destroyed there. And there was no evidence that this facility was a chemical weapons factory, which they declared was the case. And it was a complete lie. And they froze the assets of the owner here in the United States. Eventually, they had to release the assets, although they never publicly apologized for the destruction of that pharmaceutical plant that made medicines, baby formula, and so forth. So these are efforts on the part of the US to exert its authority. Clinton, during that time period, was under tremendous fire for his scandals while he was in the White House. He had been impeached, but at the same time was not convicted in the US Senate. And so, yes, that episode took place. Al Qaeda was deemed as the enemy and the culprit in that. But what people forget is that the Al Qaeda terrorist organization was actually started by the United States in Afghanistan during the late 1970s, early 1980s, to fight against the socialist-oriented government in Afghanistan, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And it was eventually overthrown. And of course, after that, they took over elements in there. And you had the Taliban government that was there. They were accusing the Taliban of harboring Al Qaeda forces there. So that this eventually, of course, led to the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 after the bombing of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in that same September 11th of 2001. So yeah, all these issues are interrelated, whether it's the question of neo-colonialism in East Africa, the so-called terrorist threat in Africa, which goes back to U.S. intelligence intervention to prevent progressive and revolutionary governments from taking power, and also the overall economic dominance of imperialism over East Africa as well. And we can see that being reexerted over the last year with the tax bill, and now with the renegotiation of the debt service of Kenya towards the Western banks.
And can you talk to us a bit more about Kenya's ties to Israel? Because you also talked a bit about that, and I think our audience would be very interested to know, yeah, how close those
Yeah,
diplomatic international ties are.
yeah. The Israelis owned, tourist destinations in Kenya. Many Israelis travel there for vacation. So yes, and they
Interesting.
also
Okay.
politically
Wow.
support. They also politically support the state of Israel, unfortunately, and this is something that people should really be aware of and outraged about, because the majority of the people on the African continent are in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. They do not support the Zionist movement. Even back during the period of the Holocaust and World War II, there were Kenyans who were there being exploited and oppressed, but Jews from various parts of Europe traveled to Kenya and Uganda seeking refuge. In fact, Uganda was one of the destinations at one point that was suggested by the World Zionist Movement for the establishment of the State of Israel.
Wow.
In fact, there's a
Interesting.
film, I think there's a film that came out maybe 20 years ago. It's called Nowhere in Africa, and it's a film about the Jewish diaspora in Uganda during World War II. I don't know how successful the film was. I saw it at a suburban theater back during that time period. But yes, they have definitely been in close alliance with the State of Israel. They do business with them. And this is quite unfortunate, considering the fact that the African Union, the 55-member African Union, says formally that it is in alliance with the Palestinians and that they oppose the genocide that is going on right now in Palestine.
Wow, interesting. Well, my final question is this, which is, what's it going to take for the Kenyan left to advance in Kenya and deal with the issues of chronic absolute poverty? Is there any hope that the Kenyan left can advance like what we see with the Sahel nations, what we saw in Senegal revolting against against French-backed successive leaderships? And although BRICS isn't a left-wing project, with South Africa and Brazil and its good relations with China and growing influence and with growing Chinese influence in Africa, in which China has always supported African sovereignty, and Russia, both under the USSR and even currently under Putin, do believe strongly in the respect for sovereignty, self-determination, and even and are even supportive of anti-colonial movements, even when it's not communist parties leading the vanguard of the revolution. And I also know with the very thorny topic of Ukraine, even many right-wing heads of states have been very reluctant to align with the West and its ongoing Cold Wars with Russia. And none of the African heads of states, including ones governed by right wingers, are too hot about the pivot to Asia. And I think it's because many deep down know that even if you're a right winger, you can't trust the West, and it's only a matter of time where the West will betray you, like they did to Mobutu. And of course, the propping up of Paul Kagame, the supporting of the Western-backed Tigrayan secessionist forces in Ethiopia, and the love-hate relationship the West had with both Robert Mugabe, the late Robert Mugabe, and Colonel Gaddafi, of uh, the latter whose ouster all or most members of the African Union opposed with respects to international relations and the growing discontent with inequality and neo-colonialism, will we see the Kenyan left advancing, especially with the Communist Party of Kenya being quite a positive people power movement in the country? I'm curious your response.
I believe that if Kenya does not correct its problems in regard to the mass poverty inside the country, its indebtedness to the international finance capitalists, that there will be more unrest and the potential for a left-wing ascendancy in the country will be quite real. We saw what happened last year. The youth who constitute the majority of the population in Kenya were quite upset with this tax bill that had been put forward by the president and his party and others in the Kenyan parliament. And it collapsed because of mass pressure. And if they institute another form of austerity in an effort to renegotiate its external debt and debt servicing, that this will provide greater openings for the left, including the Communist Party, as well as others inside of Kenya, to make a bid for the seizure of power inside the country. But this depends upon the balance of forces. It also depends upon what the Kenyan government does in regard to coming to terms with the demands of the International Monetary Fund, as well as the imperialist countries in Western Europe and North America.
Fascinating. And then this will be my final question, which is, does Kenya also do you believe like I said in my final statement, that Kenya also proves that you can be as friendly as you want with the West, you can have as many right-wing governments you want to who all do very business-friendly deals with the West, but that in the end of the day, you can't trust the West. It's only a matter of time before the West betrays you when you even want to exert whatever little sovereignty you actually even have. So do you think that will do you think that we'll also see eventually, Kenya advancing, a big Pan-Africanist left revolution, I'm curious your response to that.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. If you look at what has happened in other parts of the continent, countries like Mali, for example, which was totally, in cahoots with France and the United States, militarily and economically, now are moving in a different direction. And we even see countries like Cote d'Ivoire, for example, asking the French military forces to leave, even though the current government there, under the president, was installed by French paratroopers in 2011. Same situation with Chad, where we have a military leader there who has asked the French forces to leave. So yes, I think it's inevitable as the economic condition deteriorates, as the U.S. administration under the current Trump White House has lost all bearings, even in regard to propaganda that's favorable to the United States. A good example, of course, is the suspension of assistance for the U.S. aid, which was a good propaganda mechanism for the United States. Also, the Voice of America, which has been suspended. This was a very important propaganda arm for U.S. imperialism. Apparently, the Trump White House doesn't see any need to promote the United States as a haven for democracy and economic prosperity. So the fact that they've lost their bearings in regard to propaganda is a clear indication that the U.S. as well is on a decline, and that they're going to lose even more support on the African continent because they don't understand the fundamentals of imperialist manipulation. They don't understand the fact that you have to have some alliances in order to carry out this dominating approach to world affairs. So we can see clearly its aggravation of Canada, for example, of Britain, of Denmark, that Trump does not understand that US imperialism cannot survive on its own. It cannot perpetuate itself on its own. And this, of course, inevitably will lead to its downturn. And people in the United States have to really consider this two-party system, that we need a People's Party to actually transform US society. And it will have an impact internationally because all the debt and all the other horrible things that the United States is imposing on the majority of the population of the world will have to be transformed into something more equitable and more favorable to development on an international level.
Fascinating. Well, I think that's a good place to end. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our All Things Africa edition. We're now covering what I call the Middle and Central Africa. Well, not quite in the middle yet, but but yes, this is our All Things Kenya edition with Abayomi Azikiwe, the founder and contributing editor to the Pan-African Newswire, independent journalist and historian, who also frequently contributes to Black Agenda Report. Abayomi, you have a great weekend. And reminder, folks, donate to Pan-African Newswire and also donate to 1+1. And the next African country that we will be covering is one I never got the chance to even learn about when I was a student. So the next country we're going to be covering is Tanzania. So join us for that and see you then.